A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government, and what no just government should refuse or rest on inference. To start off with, I'd like to bring in our friend Dr. Smith. Doctor, tell us, did the Bill of Rights give Americans rights?
According to the Founding Fathers, the Bill of Rights did not create rights for Americans. Most of them would believe that the rights that we have are what they would call God-given rights. And the Bill of Rights simply recognizes those rights and then prevents government from infringing upon those particular rights. Government doesn't really create rights in that way, at least not in the way that the framers of our Constitution thought of as rights. Government respects our rights by limiting its actions in particular areas in which we do have those rights. And so our freedom of speech exists regardless of what our government does, according to the Founding Fathers. Our government respects our freedom of speech by not passing laws that infringe upon that freedom of speech. And so government doesn't create the right. Government merely recognizes the right as defined by the Bill of Rights.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. It was in 1789 that the amendments were introduced as a series of legislative articles by our fourth president, James Madison. 2 years later, in 1791, they were approved by 75% of the states and became the first 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights was designed to protect the natural rights of all Americans, to set limits on what the government can and can't do in regards to personal freedoms. The original concept of a Bill of Rights was extremely controversial. Many argued that it wasn't necessary. One such person who argued that it wasn't necessary was Alexander Hamilton, who said, "Here, in strictness, the people surrender nothing, and as they retain everything, they have no need of particular reservations." In other words, Hamilton feared that by listing specific rights, any rights that weren't listed might be lost. Someone who was very much in favor of a Bill of Rights was Thomas Jefferson, who said, "Half a loaf is better than no bread. If we cannot secure all our rights, let us secure what we can." The Bill of Rights reserves all rights not mentioned in the Constitution to the people themselves or the states. Originally, 12 articles were proposed, but only the last 10 were ratified by the states. The articles not originally included were Article 1, which dealt with the number of U.S. representatives, Article 2, which limited the power of Congress to increase its own salaries, which was eventually added as the 27th Amendment. Looking at the first 5 amendments, the first establishes individual freedoms such as free speech, free press, and free assembly. The First Amendment states, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." In other words, the Founding Fathers wanted the citizens to be able to critique the government without risking punishment. The Second Amendment has to do with the militia and the right to keep and bear arms. It states, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The Third Amendment deals with soldiers forcing their way into private homes. It says, "No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law." This amendment was made because British troops were staying in American homes without permission. The Founding Fathers wanted to make sure this never happened again. The Fourth Amendment focuses on the rights Americans have if law enforcement wants to search your property. In more detail, it says, "The right of the people to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated." The entire Fourth Amendment protects Americans from government harassment or seizure of property without constitutional justification. It is really the only amendment that confirms the right of private property and requires law enforcement to prove legal cause before entering your property for any purpose. The Fifth Amendment covers rights found in the court system, including due process and being charged with the same crime twice. No person shall be held to answer for any capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life. The Fifth Amendment also protects citizens from testifying against themselves, and it protects personal property. The Constitution is not an instrument for the government to restrain the people. It is an instrument for the people to restrain the government, lest it come to dominate our lives and interests. The Sixth Amendment talks about the rights Americans are granted in the court system. In fact, it says, "In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury." This amendment covers many areas of criminal prosecution. It states that the trial will take place where the crime was committed. It allows both sides to call on witnesses and the right to legal counsel. The Seventh Amendment continues the court theme by discussing the rights Americans have to civil trial by jury. It states, "In suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law." In other words, the Seventh Amendment protects the integrity of the court system in regards to trial by jury. It states that no judge can substitute their opinion of the facts for that of a jury. Likewise, the Eighth Amendment discusses excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishment. In more detail, it says, "Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted." In other words, the original states wanted to make sure that punishment fit the crime when it came to setting bail and fines. It also makes sure that those facing criminal charges are treated humanely. The Ninth Amendment is a particularly important one, whereas it protects the rights not particularly listed in the Constitution. It states, "The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people." In other words, just because a specific right is not mentioned in the Constitution doesn't mean the government can deny it to citizens. In fact, anything not listed should be considered just as important as any amendment already ratified. Rounding out the Bill of Rights is the key 10th Amendment, which talks about the powers of the states and of the people themselves. It states, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." This amendment confirms the fact that if the Constitution does not specifically assign a power, that power is retained by the states or by the people themselves. Now, if you remember from our last session, James Madison originally penned 12 articles, 10 of which were ratified and became what we now know as the Bill of Rights. The people may change the Constitution whenever and however they please. This is a right of which no positive institution can ever deprive them. When our founders created the Constitution, some felt that the words should be set in stone forever. Others felt that as time passed, our country would change, necessitating changes in the Constitution. Since its creation in 1788, there have been 27 amendments spanning more than 2 centuries, or roughly one every 8 years. In order to pass an amendment, the bill must first be approved by a 2/3 majority of both the House of Representatives and Senate. Once it is passed, it goes on to the states for approval. Since this usually takes a while, an expiration, normally 7 years, is placed on the amendment to be ratified by the states. To officially become an amendment, 3/4 of the country must approve the bill. At no point does the President have a role in the amendment process. The President does not have the power to veto or approve any proposed amendment. The 11th Amendment was passed in 1795. It defines judicial powers of the United States and the federal government on foreign nationals and the limitations of the citizens to sue states under federal law. 9 years later, in 1804, the 12th Amendment was ratified. It lays out guidelines for electing the President and Vice President by ballot votes. Jumping ahead to 1865, the 13th Amendment accomplished the abolition of slavery in the United States. Moving on, the 14th Amendment was passed 3 years later in 1868. It defines U.S. citizenship and all privileges that come with it. It also strengthens the right to due process and equal protection. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified. Also one of the more popular amendments, it guarantees every U.S. citizen of age the right to vote, no matter what their race, color, or status. The 16th Amendment is a favorite of the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. Passed 43 years later in 1913, it provides the federal government the power to collect income taxes. That same year, the 17th Amendment was passed, providing for the direct election of U.S. senators. 6 years later, in 1919, prohibition was put in place. The 18th Amendment prohibited the creation, transportation, and sale of alcohol. As we all know today, that amendment was eventually repealed. But more on that in our next lesson. When the people fear their government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. To recap our last lesson, amending the Constitution is not an easy thing to do. While there are two ways to propose an amendment, the only way that has ever been used first requires a bill to be approved by a two-thirds majority of both the House of Representatives and Senate. If it passes, it goes on to the states, and then requires 3/4 approval to become an amendment. And remember, at no point does the President play any role in the process. Picking up where we left off, the 19th Amendment, passed in 1920, deals with women's suffrage. It guarantees every woman of age who is an American citizen the right to vote. 13 years later, the 20th Amendment, also known as the Lame Duck Amendment, was ratified. It establishes presidential and congressional terms, putting in place the dates of term commencements for Congress to be January 3rd and President to be January 20th. That same year, the 21st Amendment was passed, which repeals the 18th Amendment's ban on alcohol. It is the only amendment in the Constitution that repeals another. It once again allowed the possession, sale, and transportation of alcohol. In 1951, 18 years later, the 22nd Amendment was established. It limits the President to serving 2 terms in office, or a maximum of 10 years if the President was once a Vice President. 10 years after that, the 23rd Amendment was passed, allowing Washington, D.C. representation in the Electoral College. In 1964, the 24th Amendment was added to the Constitution. This allows any vote cast in a primary election to be counted, regardless of whether the voter has paid their taxes or not. The 25th Amendment, which passed 3 years later, deals with presidential succession. The amendment discusses protocol for situations such as presidential health concerns, resignation, and removal from office. 4 years later, the 26th Amendment was ratified, a popular amendment among teens. The 26th Amendment establishes the national voting age at 18. Prior to 1971, anyone choosing to vote was required to be at least 21. Finally, in May 1992, the 27th Amendment was added to the United States Constitution. The 27th Amendment prevents laws affecting congressional salary from taking effect until the beginning of the next session of Congress. What is interesting to take away from all this today is that even though the Founding Fathers penned this document over 200 years ago, it still holds true today. The core values and principles in this document are still those core values and principles that most Americans feel we should all live by. Remember, the Constitution was created to protect rights, not to establish them. The Founding Fathers felt that government should be a voice for the people, empowered by the people. With the knowledge provided in our Principles of the Constitution series, we hope you have gained a new appreciation of the way that our government is constructed. That our government is built upon the foundation of a republic, not a democracy, and that your rights as an American citizen are special and should always be protected. For all of us here at the American Opinion Foundation, we thank you for watching our Principles of the Constitution series. I'm Alan Scholl for the Freedom Project. Welcome home.